Ezen ran without looking back, her feet barely touching the ground as she fled into the darkness. The village that had once been her home was now a death trap. Every shadow, every rustling leaf could mean danger. She did not know exactly where she was going, only that she had to get as far away from Obiora as possible. The forest beyond Oduma stretched endlessly, filled with twisting paths and unseen dangers, but it was better than staying behind to die. Her breath came in short, sharp gasps as she reached the outskirts of the village. The towering Irako trees loomed ahead, their branches whispering secrets in the night breeze. Some believed spirits dwelled here, guiding or devouring lost souls. Tonight, she had no choice but to risk it. With one last glance behind her, she plunged into the shadows of the forest. Back in the village, Obiora's eyes swept across the small hut, his expression unreadable. Mama Chidima stood her ground, her heart hammering in her chest. "Where is she?" he asked again, stepping closer. Mama Chidima lifted her chin. "My daughter is not here." Obiora smiled, a slow, dangerous smile. "You are lying." Her hands tightened into fists at her sides, but she did not flinch. Obiora's smile did not fade. Instead, he turned to Ikenna, who stood by the door. "Search the house." Ikenna moved instantly, tossing aside baskets, lifting mats, checking every corner. But it was too late. Ezen was already gone. Obiora let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "Ah, Ezen. You truly think you can escape me?" His gaze flickered back to Mama Chidima. The amusement in his eyes turned to something colder. "You have bought her time, but you have also signed your fate." Mama Chidima did not look away. "Do what you will. My daughter is beyond your reach now." Obiora's smile returned. "We shall see." Then, with a slow, measured step, he turned and walked into the night, his hunt far from over. Ezen's feet pounded against the earth, her breath ragged as she pushed deeper into the forest. The towering trees above swallowed the moonlight, leaving only shadows and the sound of her own racing heartbeat. She did not know how long she had been running, but fear drove her forward. Obiora would not stop hunting her. The forest was thick with twisting roots and whispering leaves, the air heavy with the scent of damp earth. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted, its cry echoing through the night. Then, a snap of a branch. Ezen froze. She pressed herself against the rough bark of a tree, her fingers trembling as she listened. Was it an animal? Or something far worse? The silence stretched. Then, another sound, footsteps. Her blood turned to ice. She was not alone. Swallowing her fear, she crouched low and began moving carefully through the undergrowth. Every step was measured, every breath controlled. She had to stay quiet. She had to stay hidden. But as she rounded a large rock, a shadow suddenly loomed in front of her. Before she could scream, a strong hand clamped over her mouth. "Quiet," a low voice hissed. Ezen's eyes widened as she stared up at the figure holding her. He was tall, his face partially hidden by the darkness, but his grip was firm, not cruel but urgent. "They are close," he whispered. "If you want to live, follow me." Ezen's heart pounded. She had no idea who he was. But the footsteps behind her were getting closer. And right now, a stranger's help was better than Obiora's death sentence. She gave a small, hesitant nod. The moon released her and gestured for her to follow. Without another word, she slipped into the shadows after him, deeper into the unknown. Ezen followed the stranger through the dense forest, her breath unsteady, her body tense with fear. Who was he? And more importantly, could she trust him? The moon moved swiftly but carefully, avoiding dry leaves and loose branches. He knew this forest well. The way he maneuvered through the darkness with ease made her wonder if he had been waiting for her. After several minutes of silent movement, they reached a small clearing. A fallen tree lay across the ground, its bark worn and damp. The man finally stopped and turned to face her. Ezen took a step back, keeping her guard up. Who are you? She whispered. The stranger studied her for a moment. Then, in a low, steady voice, he said, "My name is Dyke. And I know what Obiora has done." Ezin's heart skipped a beat. "How?" she demanded. Dyke exhaled, his gaze flickering toward the dark trees behind them, as if checking for unseen eyes. "Because I have been watching him for a long time." Ezin's stomach twisted. Could this man be another one of Obiora's servants, sent to lure her into a trap? She took another step back. "If you know what he has done, why have you not stopped him?" Dyke's jaw tightened. "Because no one fights a man like Obiora without a plan. You have seen his power, haven't you?" Ezin shuddered, memories of the blood-filled bowl and wooden idol flashing in her mind. "Then you know," Dyke continued, his voice grave. "Obiora is not just a man. He is protected by something much darker." Ezin swallowed hard. She already feared as much. "Then how do we stop him?" she whispered. Dyke's eyes darkened. "By doing what no one else has dared to do, taking his power away before he can take more lives." The wind howled through the trees, and Ezin felt it in her bones. She had escaped Obiora's grip. But the real fight was only just beginning. Ezin's mind raced. Obiora's power came from the blood he spilled, his wealth, his influence, his unshaken grip over Oduma. How could they possibly take that away? "Obiora's protection is not just from men," Dyke said, his voice grim. "It comes from the spirits he serves." Ezin shivered. She had seen it firsthand, the dark ritual, the eerie whispers in the air, the bowl of fresh blood. "Then how do we break that protection?" she asked. Dyke hesitated for a moment, then finally spoke. "There is a shrine, deep in the forbidden part of the forest. That is where Obiora made his pact. That is where his power is tied." Ezin's heart pounded. "If we destroy the shrine, will it stop him?" Dyke's jaw tightened. "If we do it right, yes. But it will not be easy. The spirits that guard his power will not let it happen without a fight." Ezin swallowed hard. A fight against spirits. Against the unseen. She had already risked her life escaping Obiora. Now, she was being asked to challenge the very forces that made him untouchable. But what choice did she have? She had seen the bodies pile up. Nkem. Olido. The others. How many more would die if they did nothing? She took a deep breath, her fingers curling into fists. "I will do whatever it takes." Dyke studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Good. We must leave before dawn." As the wind rustled the trees around them, Ezin realized something chilling. The moment they stepped into that shrine, there would be no turning back. As dawn's first light crept through the dense canopy, Ezin and Dyke set out toward the forbidden part of the forest, a place whispered about in fearful tones among the villagers. It was said that those who entered never returned. Ezin's heartbeat was unsteady as they moved deeper into the woods, each step taking them further from safety. The trees here were taller, their twisted branches forming an eerie cage around them. The air was thick, heavy, as if something unseen was watching. "No one comes here," Ezin murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Dyke nodded. "Because the spirits that Obiora serves dwell here. This is where he feeds them." Ezin swallowed hard. She could almost hear it now, a low hum in the air, like distant whispers, shifting between the trees. For a long while, they walked in silence, their only guide the sun filtering weakly through the thick foliage. Then, suddenly, Dyke halted. "We are close," he whispered. Ezin looked ahead and felt her blood run cold. There, partially hidden between two enormous trees, was a small stone shrine. Strange carvings covered its surface, symbols she had never seen before, dark and menacing. In front of it lay a large black bowl, its surface dried with the deep, rust-colored stain of old blood. Ezin's stomach twisted. She had seen this before, in Obiora's ritual. "This is where he made his pact," Dyke said, his voice laced with tension. Ezin took a shaky breath. Then this is where we end it. But just as she stepped forward, a sharp rustling came from behind the shrine. Then, a low, inhuman growl. Ezin's blood turned to ice. Something was here with them. Ezin froze as the growl deepened, reverberating through the shrine like the voice of something not of this world. The air grew thick with an unnatural cold, and a foul stench of rotting flesh filled her nostrils. Dyke's hand went to his belt, where a small dagger was tucked away. "Stay behind me," he murmured. But before either of them could move, a shadow unfurled from behind the shrine. A creature stepped forward, hunched and grotesque, its body covered in thick, mud-caked fur, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. Its mouth, too wide for its face, curled into a sinister grin, exposing jagged, blood-stained teeth. Ezin's heart slammed against her ribs. "The Guardian," Dyke whispered. The creature sniffed the air, then let out a deep, guttural chuckle. "You dare enter the sacred ground?" Its voice was like the echo of many voices, layered over one another. Ezin's legs trembled, but she forced herself to stand firm. "We know what Obiora has done. We know this is where he made his pact." The creature's head tilted unnaturally, as if amused. "And do you think you can undo what has been sealed in blood?" Dyke stepped forward, raising his dagger. "We will see." The Guardian's laughter echoed through the trees, shaking the very ground beneath them. Then, in a blur of motion, it lunged. Ezin barely had time to scream before the fight for their lives began. The Guardian moved like smoke, shifting unnaturally fast despite its monstrous form. Before Ezin could react, it was upon them. Dyke barely dodged in time, rolling to the side as the creature's clawed hand slashed through the air. It struck the ground instead, sending a spray of dirt and shattered wood flying. Ezin stumbled backward, her heart hammering. How were they supposed to fight something like this? Dyke lunged, his dagger flashing in the dim light. The blade found its mark, sinking into the Guardian's shoulder. The creature roared, but to Ezin's horror, it didn't fall. Instead, it grabbed Dyke's wrist with unnatural strength, and hurled him across the clearing. Dyke crashed into a tree, groaning in pain. The Guardian turned to Ezin, its red eyes burning into hers. "Your blood will feed the master," it hissed. Terror clawed at her chest, but something deeper, stronger, rose within her. She could not die here. She would not. Her eyes darted to the shrine. If this creature was protecting it, then... "Dyke," she shouted. "The shrine. Destroy the shrine." Dyke gritted his teeth, and forced himself to his feet. His eyes flickered to the shrine, then to the Guardian. He understood. With a roar, he charged past the creature and drove his dagger into the stone shrine. The effect was immediate. The Guardian let out an unearthly shriek, its body convulsing as the air around them shimmered violently. Cracks rippled through the stone, glowing with an eerie red light. The creature staggered, clutching its chest as if something were being torn from it. Its glowing eyes dimmed, and for the first time, fear flickered across its monstrous face. "No. No," it howled. Dyke struck the shrine again, and with a final, ear-splitting crack, the stone split apart. The Guardian let out one last blood-curdling scream, and then, in an instant, it was gone. Silence fell over the clearing. The air felt lighter, less oppressive. But Ezin's relief was short-lived. Dyke turned to her, his breathing heavy. "It is done." But deep in her heart, Ezin knew, Obiora would feel this. And when he did, he would come for them. Far away, in the heart of Oduma, Obiora woke with a start. A sharp, searing pain shot through his chest as if something had been ripped from his soul. His fingers dug into the silk sheets beneath him, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The spirits were angry. He knew why. With a snarl he sat up, his eyes glowing with fury. He could feel it, something had been broken. A part of his power, the very essence of his dark pact, had been severed. Someone had dared to touch his shrine. Obiora's jaw clenched. Who would be foolish enough to challenge him? Then, suddenly, he knew. Ezen, he growled, the name dripping with venom. The girl had escaped, yes, but now, she had done something far worse. Obiora closed his eyes, reaching out with his mind, searching for the spirits he still controlled. Their whispers were frantic, hissing with rage. She has defiled your altar, master. She has called upon ruin. She must die. Obiora's fists tightened. Find her, he commanded, his voice deadly calm. I want her alive. But the one who helped her, kill him. A sinister wind howled through the night, and in the darkness, shadows began to move. Ezen had struck first. But now, Obiora was coming. Ezen and Dyke stood in the clearing, breathing heavily, their eyes locked on the shattered shrine. The air around them still hummed with lingering energy, but the immediate danger had passed. Or so they thought. Dyke suddenly stiffened, his eyes darting toward the trees. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no insects, nothing. He knows, Dyke murmured. Ezen felt a chill crawl up her spine. Obiora. Dyke nodded. We broke his connection to this shrine, but he still holds power. And now he will come for us. Ezen swallowed hard. She had known Obiora would retaliate, but the realization that he could already be hunting them sent terror pulsing through her veins. We have to leave, she said quickly. Now. Dyke didn't argue. He turned on his heel and led her deeper into the forest, moving swiftly, his every step precise. But even as they ran, Ezen could not shake the feeling that something unseen was following them. Somewhere in the distance, a low, unnatural whisper slithered through the trees. Ezen. Her blood turned to ice. It was his voice. She grabbed Dyke's arm, panic rising in her chest. Did you hear that? Dyke's expression was grim. I heard it. They picked up their pace, weaving through the dense undergrowth, their breath coming in ragged gasps. But no matter how far they ran, the whispers grew louder, closer. And then, suddenly, a shadow moved ahead of them. Ezen's steps skidded to a halt. Dyke reached for his dagger, his eyes narrowing. The path was no longer empty. Standing between them and their only escape was a tall, hooded figure. The air around him pulsed with dark energy. And when he lifted his head, his eyes glowed red. Obiora has sent me, the figure rasped. And none of you will leave this forest alive. The hooded figure stepped forward, the darkness around him shifting like a living thing. Cold fear gripped Ezen's chest. This was not just a man, this was one of Obiora's servants, a being infused with dark power. Dyke raised his dagger, his stance firm, though Ezen could see the tension in his shoulders. We are not afraid of you, he said. The figure let out a low chuckle. Then you are fools. Without warning, he lunged. Dyke reacted instantly, dodging to the side as the figure's clawed hand slashed through the air. The very force of it sent a gust of wind tearing through the trees, rustling leaves violently. Ezen stumbled backward, her heart pounding. She had no weapon, no way to fight back. But she could not just stand there. Her eyes darted around, searching for anything she could use. A sharp branch. A rock. Anything. Dyke and the hooded figure clashed again, their movements fast and brutal. Dyke's dagger sliced through the air, but the figure moved unnaturally, shifting like mist before reforming solid. You cannot fight shadows, the figure hissed. Then, in a sudden burst of speed, he grabbed Dyke by the throat. Ezen gasped as Dyke struggled, his feet lifting off the ground. The figure's grip was inhumanly strong. You were a fool to defy Obiora, the figure said, his voice like a snake's whisper. Dyke gasped for air, his dagger slipping from his fingers. Panic surged through Ezen's veins. She had to do something. Her hands grasped the nearest thing, a heavy rock. Without thinking, she rushed forward and slammed it against the figure's head. The impact was sharp, the sound sickening. The figure staggered, his grip loosening just enough. Dyke tore free and dropped to the ground, gasping for breath. Without hesitation, He snatched his dagger and drove it deep into the figure's chest. The figure let out an unearthly shriek. The dark energy around him flared violently, then began to dissolve. His body shuddered and collapsed into nothing but a wisp of black smoke. Silence, silence. Ezen stood frozen, her breath ragged. The spot where the figure had stood was now empty, but the air was still thick with unseen danger. Dyke turned to her, his eyes fierce. "We need to move. Now." Ezen nodded. They had won this fight, but Obiora would not stop. And the next battle would be even worse. Ezen and Dyke moved swiftly through the forest, their feet crunching against damp leaves, their breaths heavy but controlled. The air still felt wrong, thick with unseen danger. Though the hooded figure was gone, Obiora's presence lingered. "He knows we are alive," Dyke muttered as they navigated the winding paths. "He will send more." Ezen clenched her fists. "Then we must reach the village before he does." Dyke nodded, but his expression was grim. "It's not just us he will punish. He will make the villagers suffer for this." A deep sense of dread settled in Ezen's chest. The people of Oduma already feared Obiora, but if he believed the village had turned against him, his vengeance would be merciless. They moved faster, but with each step, Ezen felt an uneasy sensation creeping over her skin. It was as if they were being watched. Then, suddenly, a whisper. "You think you can run from me?" Ezen stumbled to a stop, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was everywhere and nowhere at once, slithering through the trees like the wind. Dyke's hand flew to his dagger, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Obiora." The whisper turned into laughter, deep and menacing. "You have touched what is mine, and now, I will take everything from you." The wind howled through the trees, and before Ezen could react, a heavy force slammed into her, knocking her to the ground. She gasped, her vision spinning, as something cold and invisible coiled around her throat. "You should have died in my chamber," the voice rasped in her ear. "But now, you will wish you had." Dyke lunged forward, slashing his dagger through the air, but it met nothing. Ezen gasped for breath, her fingers clawing at her throat, but there was nothing to grab. Obiora's power was strangling her without even touching her. Her vision blurred. Dyke shouted her name, but his voice was distant. She was slipping away. And then, a loud crack split the air. The unseen force around her vanished, and she collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Dyke was standing over her, holding a small vial that reeked of something foul. The liquid inside glowed a dull, eerie blue. What is that?" Ezen wheezed. "A charm against his magic," Dyke said, his voice strained. "But it won't last long. We need to go. Now." Ezen nodded weakly, forcing herself to her feet. Obiora was stronger than they had imagined. If they wanted to survive, they had to end this soon. Because next time, they might not be so lucky. Ezen and Dyke burst out of the forest, their bodies aching, their lungs heaving for air. The moment they stepped onto the dirt path leading into Oduma, they knew something was wrong. Smoke curled into the sky. A woman's piercing scream echoed in the distance. Ezen's stomach twisted. "No." Dyke's face darkened. "We're too late." They ran toward the village, their feet kicking up dust. As they drew closer, chaos unfolded before them. Huts were burning, their thatched roofs consumed by roaring flames. Villagers ran in every direction, their terrified cries filling the air. Some clutched wounded loved ones, others lay motionless on the ground, their bodies twisted in unnatural ways. Ezen's chest tightened. This wasn't just an attack, this was a message. A shadow moved through the smoke. Then another. More hooded figures. Obiora's servants had arrived first. "Find them," a deep voice commanded. "Obiora wants them alive." Ezen and Dyke ducked behind a fallen cart, their hearts pounding. "He's tearing the village apart to get to us," Dyke murmured. Ezen's fists clenched. This was because of them. Because they had challenged him. She thought of the villagers, the innocent men, women, and children, paying the price for their defiance. "We have to stop this," she said, her voice shaking with anger. "We have to stop him." Dyke turned to her, his expression grim. "Then we must do what no one has dared before." Ezen met his gaze, her heart racing. "We must kill Obiora." Ezen's breath caught in her throat at Dyke's words. The idea of killing Obiora had always seemed impossible, like trying to strike down a god. But as she looked around at the burning village, the wailing families, and the bodies littering the streets, she knew there was no other choice. "How?" she whispered, forcing herself to stay calm. Dyke's jaw tightened. "Obiora draws his power from sacrifices and the shrine. We broke one of his sources, but he's still too strong. We need to destroy his true altar, the one where he made the original pact." Ezen nodded slowly. If they could sever his connection to the spirits, he would become vulnerable. But there was one problem. "Do you know where it is?" she asked. Dyke hesitated, his brow furrowed. "No. But I know someone who does." Ezen's eyes widened. "Who?" Before Dyke could answer, a loud crash shattered the air. They turned just in time to see a group of villagers fighting back, wielding machetes and wooden clubs against Obiora's hooded minions. Fearless. Desperate. But the dark figures were too powerful. One of them raised a hand, and Amun was flung into the air as if an invisible force had grabbed him by the throat. Ezen's blood boiled. "We have to help them," she said, gripping Dyke's arm. He gritted his teeth. "It's a risk. We need to stay hidden." But Ezen shook her head. "They're fighting for their lives. For us. If we let them die, then what kind of people are we?" Dyke hesitated for a second, then nodded sharply. "We move fast. We take them down and disappear before more come." Ezen didn't wait. She grabbed a fallen spear from the ground and charged. The time for hiding was over. Ezen rushed forward, her grip tightening around the spear. The hooded figures were focused on the villagers, their dark forms moving with an unnatural grace. One of them lifted his hand toward a young man, ready to strike. Without thinking, Ezen hurled her spear. The weapon whistled through the air and struck the figure in the chest. A dark, inhuman shriek tore from its lips as it staggered backward, its body dissolving into black mist. The villagers paused in shock, then realization dawned in their eyes. "They can be killed," someone shouted. A new fire ignited in their spirits. Dyke moved swiftly, his dagger flashing as he drove it into the side of another dark servant. The figure let out a horrid screech before collapsing into nothing. The villagers fought harder. Their clubs and machetes now struck with purpose. For the first time, the hooded figures hesitated. They were not invincible. A woman swung a metal rod, smashing the mask of one servant, sending it cracking apart. Another villager drove a stake through the chest of another. One by one, they fell. Ezen ducked and rolled, narrowly avoiding a dark figure's grasp. She grabbed a burning piece of wood from a fallen hut, and swung it toward the creature. The flames licked its robes, and it let out a hideous shriek, twisting and writhing before bursting into ash. Dyke turned to her, eyes blazing. "Fire. Fire weakens them." The villagers heard him, and in moments, torches were raised high. The hooded figures screeched and backed away. And then, they fled. A deep silence fell over the village. The only sound was the crackling flames of burning huts, and the heavy breathing of the survivors. Ezen's hands shook. They had won. But for how long? She turned to Dyke. "Who is the person that knows where Obiora's true altar is?" Dyke's expression darkened. "The only man who ever escaped Obiora's grasp. Anakai, the outcast." The name Anakai sent a wave of uncertainty through Ezen. She had heard the stories, a madman, a traitor, a man cursed by the gods. He had been banished from Oduma years ago after speaking of things that no one dared to listen to. Anakai, she repeated, catching her breath. He's still alive? Dyke nodded, his face shadowed in the flickering firelight. If anyone knows where Obiora's true altar is, it's him. But finding him won't be easy. Ezen glanced at the villagers around them. The battle was over, but the scars remained. Homes were still smoldering, and some families knelt beside their dead. How do we even begin to look for him? She asked. A weak voice rose from behind them. You will not have to search far. Ezen and Dyke spun around. An old man stepped forward, his frame thin and bent with age. His eyes were clouded but sharp, his face lined with the weight of many years. His clothes were tattered, his hair tangled with twigs and dust. The villagers gasped and moved back in fear. Anakai, Dyke whispered. The old man chuckled dryly. I wondered how long it would take before someone came looking for me. Ezen stared at him. This was the man they had feared. You know where the altar is? She asked cautiously. Anakai's smile faded. He looked past them, toward the ruins of Oduma, his eyes filled with something unreadable. I know, he said simply. And I know what must be done. Ezen's heart pounded. Then tell us, Dyke demanded. We must destroy it before Obiora grows even stronger. Anakai's gaze locked onto them, unblinking. You do not understand what you ask, he said. Obiora's altar is not merely hidden, it is protected by a force older and darker than any of you can comprehend. Ezen felt a chill creep up her spine. Then how do we break it? She asked. Anakai's expression hardened. To destroy the altar, you must be willing to pay the price. Dyke frowned. What price? Anakai's eyes darkened. Blood. Ezen's breath caught in her throat. Blood, she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Anakai's face remained grim. Obiora's altar is bound by the blood of his sacrifices. To destroy it, a greater sacrifice must be made. Dyke stepped forward, his jaw clenched. Whose blood? Anakai's gaze did not waver. The blood of the one who dares to undo what was done. A life, for an altar. Ezen's stomach twisted. You mean one of us has to die? Anakai nodded slowly. Yes. And not just any death. The spirits demand a willing sacrifice. Someone must give themselves freely, or the altar will remain untouched. The air around them grew heavy. The weight of the truth settled in Ezen's chest like a stone. They had fought so hard, come so far, only to be told that one of them had to die for the battle to end. Dyke's hands curled into fists. There has to be another way. Anakai sighed. If there was, I would have destroyed it myself long ago. But the spirits do not bargain. They only take. Silence stretched between them. Ezen looked at the burned remains of the village. At the bodies of the fallen. At the faces of those who had suffered because of Obiora's greed. She knew what she had to do. Then take me. Dyke's head snapped toward her. What? No. Ezen stood firm. This has to end, Dyke. If my life is the price, then I will pay it. Dyke grabbed her shoulders. His eyes burned with anger and desperation. We will find another way. You are not dying for this. Anakai watched them in silence, his expression unreadable. You have time to decide, he said finally. But not much. Obiora grows stronger with every moment you delay. Ezen met Dyke's gaze. She had made up her mind. But she could see in his eyes, so had he. And he would not let her go so easily. Ezen and Dyke stood in tense silence, the weight of Anakai's words pressing down on them like a heavy stone. Around them, the villagers gathered, their eyes filled with both fear and hope. We can't just accept this, Dyke said firmly, his voice low. There has to be another way. Ezen shook her head. You heard him, Dyke. This is the only way. But Dyke wasn't ready to surrender to fate. His hands tightened into fists, his eyes burning with determination. If there's a way to undo magic, then there's a way to destroy that altar without a sacrifice. Anakai sighed, watching them with knowing eyes. Many have thought as you do. Many have tried. And all have failed. Dyke turned to him sharply. Then tell us what happened. How did you escape Obiora's grasp? The old man's face darkened, his gaze flickering to the scars on his arms. Memories swam behind his eyes, memories too painful to be spoken lightly. I did not escape, he said finally. I was spared. Azin stilled. Spared. Anakai nodded, stepping closer. Years ago, I was one of the many who fell into Obiora's trap. He lured me with riches, just as he did with so many others. But when the time came for my blood to be spilled, the spirits refused me. Dyke frowned. Why? Anakai's lips twisted into something between a smirk and a grimace. Because I had nothing left to give. My family was dead, my name was cursed, and I had no desires left in my heart. The spirits feast on ambition, greed, and fear. But I was already a broken man. Azin's heart pounded. Then, that means the spirits don't just take anyone. They take those who still have something to lose. Anakai nodded. That is why Obiora preys on those who want more than what they have. And that is why, for the altar to be destroyed, the sacrifice must come from someone who still holds life dearly. A heavy silence fell over them. Dyke looked at Azin, his expression unreadable. Then what if someone who has nothing to lose destroys it? Anakai's eyes darkened. That has never been tested. Azin could see the thought forming in Dyke's mind, a dangerous, reckless idea. Dyke, she began, but he cut her off. The night was restless. Though the battle in Oduma had ended, fear still lingered in the air. The villagers whispered among themselves, some mourning the dead, others tending to the wounded. But no one slept peacefully. Azin sat by the dying fire, staring at the embers as they glowed like tiny spirits in the dark. Dyke was a few feet away, sharpening his blade, his face set in hard determination. Anakai sat between them, his aged hands clasped together. He had agreed to guide them, but there was no certainty in his voice, only the wisdom of a man who had seen too much. The altar is hidden deep in the forest, Anakai murmured, breaking the silence. Far beyond where any sane man dares to walk. It was built on cursed land, where the spirits first answered Obiora's call. Dyke looked up. How far? Anakai exhaled, his eyes distant. A full day's journey. But the road is not safe. Obiora has protectors watching over the path. Creatures that do not sleep. Spirits that wander, waiting for the next soul to claim. Azin shivered. The weight of the unknown pressed against her chest. She had thought she was prepared for anything, but the darkness surrounding Obiora's power seemed endless. You are afraid, Anakai said, turning to her. She hesitated before answering. Wouldn't you be? Anakai gave a dry chuckle. Fear is not a weakness, child. It is a reminder that you still have something to live for. Dyke set his blade down and met Azin's gaze. That's exactly why you can't be the one to sacrifice yourself. If the spirits crave life, then maybe someone with nothing left can defy them. Azin gritted her teeth. And you think that person is you? Dyke didn't answer right away. Instead, he glanced around at the sleeping villagers, the ones who had lost their homes, their families, their futures. If it means stopping Obiora, then yes, he finally said. Azin shook her head. I won't let you do this alone. Dyke's expression softened, but before he could respond, Anakai cleared his throat. None of you may get to decide, he muttered. Azin and Dyke turned to him sharply. What do you mean? Anakai's eyes gleamed in the firelight. The spirits choose their own sacrifice. The fire crackled, sending up a spray of embers. And in that moment, the wind shifted, a low whisper curling through the trees. Something was watching them. Waiting. The journey had already begun. The wind twisted through the trees, carrying with it a low murmur, not the sound of rustling leaves but voices. Ezen froze, her skin prickling. The whispers were faint but growing louder, curling around them like unseen hands. Dyke's grip tightened on his blade. They're here. Anakai remained still, his aged eyes half-closed, as if listening to something the others could not hear. The spirits know we are coming, he murmured. And they are not pleased. Ezen's pulse pounded. She had known this journey would be dangerous, but she had not expected to feel the weight of unseen eyes pressing down on her, as if the forest itself was alive and watching. We should leave now, she whispered. Anakai shook his head. No. We must wait for first light. Traveling through the cursed lands at night is an invitation to death. Dyke scowled. Then we'll keep watch. Anakai didn't argue. He simply stared into the trees, his expression grim. The spirits will test us before we even reach the altar, he said. Be ready. The night stretched long and heavy. The whispers never ceased. Sometimes they were soft, coaxing, like a lover calling from the shadows. Other times they were harsh, guttural, filled with anger and warning. Ezen sat with her back against a fallen log, her arms wrapped around herself. She had faced death before, but this was different. Do you hear what they're saying? She asked quietly. Dyke, who sat beside her, nodded stiffly. They're trying to get inside our heads. Ezen swallowed hard. And if they do? Dyke didn't answer. Because they both knew, if the spirits broke them before they even reached the altar, they would never make it back alive. And as the whispers grew louder, curling into her ears like poison, Ezen knew the true battle had already begun. The whispers slithered through the trees, wrapping around Ezen like unseen coils. They were no longer just faint murmurs, they had become clear voices, calling her by name. Ezen, come back to us. She squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her hands over her ears. But the voices only grew louder. We miss you, Ezen. Don't you miss us? Her breath hitched. That voice, it was familiar. She turned sharply, her heart pounding, and froze. There, just beyond the firelight, stood a figure. A woman dressed in a flowing white wrapper, her head tilted slightly, her face obscured by shadow. Mama. Ezen whispered, her voice barely audible. The woman took a step forward, and the firelight flickered over her face. It was her mother. Tears burned in Ezen's eyes. No, you're not real. Her mother smiled softly. Oh, my child. Why do you say that? Have you forgotten me already? The ground beneath Ezen felt unsteady. It had been years since her mother died, since she was taken by sickness. The pain of losing her had never truly left. Come, Ezen, her mother said, opening her arms. You don't have to fight anymore. You don't have to suffer. Come with me, and everything will be as it was. Ezen stumbled forward, her body moving on its own. Warmth. Safety. Peace. But then. Ezen. Dyke's voice shattered the illusion. A hand grabbed her wrist, yanking her backward. The moment she fell away from the spirit's reach, her mother's face twisted. The soft, kind expression melted into something monstrous. Her eyes turned black as coal, her smile stretching too wide, revealing jagged teeth. She let out a horrid screech, and in an instant, vanished into smoke. Ezen gasped, her chest heaving. Dyke was kneeling beside her, his grip still firm on her arm. What did you see? He asked, his voice tense. Ezen's throat was dry. My mother. Dyke's expression darkened. The spirits are playing tricks on us. Ezen shivered. The spirits weren't just watching, they were testing them, searching for their weaknesses, luring them into the darkness. And if Dyke hadn't stopped her in time, she might never have come back. She looked at him, her voice barely a whisper. We need to leave. Now. If you like my stories, follow, share, subscribe, like and comment for the next part as the story gets interestingly hot.